Good evening and welcome to the Stroud Mansion. I'm John Abel, and I know that all of us are here tonight because we're anxious to find out about this gentleman, Sam Collins. I knew his brother, Tom Collins, pretty well years ago. So I will get right to introducing our speaker tonight, Bill Weitzmann, who was a teacher at Stroudsburg High School for 47 years, which I believe is an accomplishment in and of itself. He also had his own photography business, and he was an adjunct professor of photography at East Stroudsburg University. Bill served on the committee, at the 2015 committee, to celebrate Stroudsburg's 200th birthday, and he is the editor of a very, very fine publication, Stroudsburg at 200. If you haven't seen it, snag yourself a copy this evening before you go. So without further ado, we'll find out about Mr. Collins from Mr. Weitzmann. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for coming, and for this evening, welcome to the world of Sam Collins. So let's get right into it. Okay, Stroudsburg has a fascinating history of more than 200 years, full of prominent industrialists, lawyers, doctors, but there are not many eccentric or mysterious characters to be found in that story. When we came across the life of Sam Collins recounted in the New York Tribune article from 1921, we knew we had stumbled upon something unique, a strange chapter almost completely erased from local memory. The Tribune article is titled "The Seventh Son's Ill Luck Overtook Sam Collins at Last." Collins was born in 1846, the seventh son of a wealthy British family, and the article framed his life around the superstitious belief of a lifelong curse. Apparently, Sam's father even held a mock funeral for the boy, casting him out of the family for fear of taking on bad luck. The supposed curse is said to have haunted Sam his entire life. At age 18, Sam left England for America and was a newspaper correspondent during the latter part of the Civil War. He was later employed at a publishing house in New York City, quickly gaining a reputation as a rare book dealer for wealthy families. Eventually, he became a top art dealer and amassed a large amount of wealth, facilitating multi-million-dollar transactions. The article claimed he was a dealer for J.P. Morgan, although this fact is reported to be a falsification in other sources. Sam married Clara Church of New York and decided to move to Stroudsburg, as the article states, quote, "to live the life of an aristocratic country gentleman," end quote. The writer goes on to describe the high standing Sam had in town at that time. We read, "Stroudsburg will never forget Sam Collins. He was," any of the older residents tell the story with a flush of pride, "the only bona fide art connoisseur who ever settled in Stroudsburg. Whenever things grew dull, the town looked to Sam Collins, and Sam Collins always made good." The main residence of Sam and Clara Collins was Harriet Hall, an elegant Victorian house at 807 Main Street, which stood where the YMCA building is today. The house is also referred to as the Jacob Singmaster property, built in 1862. Singmaster was a wealthy businessman who made his fortune with a tannery located in that part of town. A bachelor, he built this impressive brick home for himself for $30,000. It had large rooms with high ceilings, a large front porch, and a front yard separated from Main Street by an 8-foot-high iron fence. When he died in 1875, the Harriet Hall property passed to his brothers, Henry and James, and then ultimately, after Henry's death, James sold it to Clara Collins in 1895 for $20,800. Interestingly, Clara was an active real estate agent investor around this time. Reviewing the Collins real estate activity in Monroe County Courthouse records, one will find almost 50 real estate transactions between 1881 and 1918, almost all of them in Clara's name. Typically, real estate transactions in the 1800s and early 1900s were made in the name of the husband. And if the wife was mentioned on the deed at all, she was listed as the wife. Overwhelmingly, the deeds transacted by the Collins listed only Clara as the owner. In 1898, in a complex transaction, Clara purchased 8 parcels of land on what is today Godfrey's Ridge from William Rees and his wife of New York City. At the same time, added the Harriet house property to this deed. All told, they incurred a mortgage for $20,560 with this settlement. The Collins then built a large building on Godfrey's Ridge in 1902 as a summer home for $100,000, which they called Shirley Hall. The building was 185 feet long, 42 feet wide, and in addition to the kitchen, dining, living rooms, and offices, the first floor contained 13 bedrooms, the second floor contained 18 bedrooms, and the third floor contained 12 bedrooms. It sat atop the ridge overlooking South Stroudsburg and was accessible from what was then the Stroudsburg to Cherry Valley Road, or today's State Route 191. Shirley Hall boasted a man-made lake, a 189-foot well, stables with thoroughbred horses, and a hanging garden. It commanded a 20-mile view of the surrounding landscape. Sam and Clara settled quite well into Stroudsburg life. They contributed liberally to local charities. Sam often traveled for art dealing work. The couple adopted a daughter named Lillian, and she was often seen being driven around town in a pony cart. Sadly, we have not found any photos of Lillian from that period. However, in the photo of Harriet Hall, there's a child standing in the doorway, and some believe that may be Lillian. It was the summer of 1904 that tragedy struck the family when Lillian Collins died suddenly under tragic circumstances. The Tribune article stated that she died of a gunshot wound, first reported as a suicide and then later as an accident. Upon further digging, a complicated story emerged. With the help of B.J. Bachman, the now retired archivist in the Monroe County Courthouse archives, we were able to look at the original coroner's report of Lillian's death. Robert Groover, Justice of the Peace, describes the events in detail. Lillian was killed by a single self-inflicted shot from a revolver that penetrated her heart. Sam and Clara were both downstairs when the shot was heard, and they discovered Lillian. As the gun apparently belonged to Clara, Lillian's death was no doubt, utterly devastating. Even more humanizing details emerged in a local obituary. Dr. C.D. Groover was summoned. He ran his horse, but arrived too late. The spark of life had fled, and he judged the girl had died within 5 minutes after the injury. He administered for Mrs. Collins, who was in a state bordering on collapse. Regarding Lillian, she was one who would draw more than a passing notice from the fact that she was very pretty and attractive. She had everything money could procure for her. Mrs. Collins had been her tutor and the girl showed a quickness and intelligence which was a delight to her parents. She was had a passionate disposition, and at times inclined to be unruly, but was much loved by those who knew her. From the Allentown Democrat, January 4th, 1905, we read, quote, "The unfortunate close of the promising life of Miss Lillian Collins, the 16-year-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Collins of Stroudsburg, Monroe County, who died from a pistol shot self-inflicted late last summer, and which caused much excitement in that community at the time, was vividly recalled last week with the arrest of Mrs. Fanny Lambert and her incarceration in the county jail. On the day the girl committed the deed, she was discovered reading a letter, and on being asked the contents by her mother, she refused to reveal them and tore the letter to bits. On being reproved for her actions, which any dutiful mother might do, the girl, in a fit of rage, rushed to her mother's bedroom, seized the pistol, and fired the fatal shot. The parts of the letter were carefully gathered and pieced together, and as a result, an investigation was set on foot, which resulted in the arrest of Mrs. Lambert. 3 prominent merchants went bail for the sum of $500 for Mrs. Lambert's appearance at next term of court. More clues from the Reading Eagle. Mrs. Fanny Lambert was arrested, charged with conspiracy to entice Lillian Collins, 16 years old, from her home. What was in that letter that caused Lillian to take such drastic action? Or could the shot have been fired accidentally? Who was Fanny Lambert? And was she trying to convince Lillian to leave home? The census from 1920 shows Fanny as 54 years old, widowed, living at 405 Main Street, Stroudsburg, with no listed profession. Her son and daughter were workers at the woolen mill. A grand jury document in the archives states that Fanny Lambert and Harry Mullicky could not be located to be called into trial, and so no inquiry ever happened. It would be easy to surmise that this whole episode surrounding Lillian destroyed Clara and Sam's spirit, and the failure of the courts to hold anyone to account was the straw that broke the camel's back. With this sad incident unresolved in the legal system, Sam and Clara left Stroudsburg in a fit of anger. From the Philadelphia Inquirer, March 1905, we read, "Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Collins, wealthy residents of this town, have announced their determination to leave Monroe County for good and make their permanent residence in New York City. The ignoring of a bill by the grand jury in which they were interested is believed to be the real reason for the change of residence." Several months ago, Mrs. Collins had Mrs. Fanny Lambert arrested, charging conspiracy. It was alleged that Mrs. Lambert tried to persuade their daughter Lillian, now dead, to leave home. The grand jury yesterday ignored the bill. Before leaving town, Mr. Collins said that they would never return here to live, and that the contract which had been awarded for the erection of a $10,000 mausoleum to hold the remains of their dead daughter would be canceled and the body removed. Shortly after this tragic incident, the Collins finances started to be a problem. In 1908, Sam Collins was arrested in New York for selling fraudulent works of art to a Francis Wilson, a comedian. Collins countersued, and the dispute was settled out of court. He was also sued for $3,500 for selling John Beckley a fake painting alleged to be by the French realism painter Julien Dupré, who lived from 1851 to 1910. Collins was again arrested 2 years later, accused of misrepresentation by a number of his old wealthy clients. It seemed Collins may have been selling fraudulent works of art for a good part of his career. Clara Collins appears to have opened a beauty salon on Fifth Avenue in New York. In the courthouse archives, we found several court cases brought against both Sam and Clara, most involving debts such as loans and mortgages gone unpaid. In one case, the same Dr. Groover, who rushed to Lillian's side on that fateful day, sued Clara for $271.50 for services performed on credit from 1904 to 1907. He presented a list of all visits made multiple times per month, which suggests Clara developed chronic medical or mental health issues. He even traveled to Scranton and New York on occasion to treat her. One fascinating document was a full transcript of a court case involving a faulty boiler installed at Harriet Hall. Sam Collins himself testified in the case, detailing all the leaks and faults in the installation of the machine, as well as the damage it caused to his expensive carpets. He presented himself as a well-spoken professional with an eye for detail and obvious experience arguing in a legal setting. Although it seemed Sam and Clara occasionally alternated between New York City and Stroudsburg during these few years, they reappeared in Stroudsburg in 1911. Clara had purchased land in South Stroudsburg on the east side of what is now Broad Street for $30,000, mostly undeveloped farmland at the time, and she attempted to sell lots in a planned grid called Collins Court. The plan was published in the Times-Democrat Christmas number 1911. Interestingly, again, the ad states Collins Court is the property of Clara Collins, although S. Collins is the contact name at the bottom. Collins Court contains streets with names such as Lillian Avenue, Clara Avenue, Collins Street, and Church Street. A stone arch gateway was constructed in memory of Lillian, and wide streets were designed into the plan. One distinguishing feature was that the plan specified trees be planted on each side of the streets, well away from the roadway. To this day, most of those original trees, typically maples, are still standing well over 100 years later. Ultimately, the development attempt was unsuccessful, and Collins Court was sold off at sheriff's sale to new owners on May 16, 1916. The memorial archway was dismantled. Notably, the roads laid out by the Collins became the grid used for modern South Stroudsburg, but with new names. The Collins Street name is the only one that survives in South Stroudsburg today, but Bryant Street in particular retains some of its original grandeur in memory of its first namesake, Lillian. On July 10, 1914, Sam and Clara sold off Harriet House for $30,000, a substantial profit from when they purchased it in 1894. No doubt that profit helped to cover these mounting court settlements. Harriet Hall was shortly acquired by Mrs. W. Burnett Easton of Thomas Street in Stroudsburg, who donated the building to the YMCA in 1915. Additions and modifications were built, and Harriet Hall was in continual use as the YMCA of the Stroudsburgs until 1955, when it was torn down and replaced by the modern building that stands there today. Shirley Hall was converted into Shirley Inn, a vacationer hotel. Wind tore off part of the Shirley Inn roof and damaged an expensively frescoed room. A Stroudsburg Times article quoted Collins, promising the inn would still be open for the season on schedule. Perhaps the ultimate indignity for Sam and Clara Collins happened on January 10, 1918, when the Shirley Inn property was sold by sheriff's sale to Mr. Edwin Osper, a New York City resident, for $10,325, a loss of almost $10,000 from the original purchase in 1898, not including the building costs for the development of the inn. By this time, the property consisted of the land, main buildings, a helper's cottage, pumping station, barn, garage, and other small outbuildings. The failure of the Collins fortune signaled the end of their story in Stroudsburg. While living in a Broadway hotel in 1916, Sam Collins attempted suicide by ingesting, quote, 170 grains of sulfonal dissolved in hot milk, whatever that is. With $500 cash in his pocket, he was treated at the prison ward of Bellevue Hospital. Sometime after 1918, it's said that friends of Clara Collins arranged to have her sent to a sanatorium under an assumed name. Reportedly, the facility was in Haddonfield, New Jersey. We could not find any more information to indicate what happened to Clara at the end of her life. In 1921, Sam was found unconscious in a boarding house in Newark, New Jersey. He was 75 years old and carried with him 87 cents and a pair of gold cufflinks, all that remained of his previous fortune. He died of a heart affliction in the city hospital and was almost buried there in the Potter's Field until, according to the Tribune, the doctor contacted Stroudsburg. Had they ever heard of a man by the name of Samuel Collins? Had they, the only art connoisseur who ever picked Stroudsburg as a hometown. He was identified and arrangements were made for him to be sent to Stroudsburg by Frederick Kerr, a former friend and art dealer from Newark. Despite this account, the final resting place of Sam, Clara, and Lillian remains a mystery. Every article about the death of Sam Collins implied that he was buried in the Stroudsburg Cemetery at the $10,000 mausoleum previously built for Lillian. However, the Inquirer article from 1905 suggested the mausoleum contract was canceled before even being built, and Lillian's body was moved. Today, although Stroudsburg Cemetery records point to a designated Collins plot, no grave, marker, or mausoleum whatsoever is to be found. A probing of the gravesite for coffins by cemetery staff proved inconclusive. Are they buried on this plot and the mausoleum built but later removed, or are they interred somewhere else? Currently, efforts have been made to obtain a ground-penetrating radar unit to see what lies below ground, but this remains for future investigation. The Shirley Inn has become a sort of legacy for Collins. In 1920, the inn, now owned by Mr. Osper of New York City, hosted a jazz ball that was a major social event for African Americans, attracting guests from out of town and perhaps helping to establish the Pocono jazz community. At its height, the inn boasted an impressive array of facilities and buildings, as reported by the Stroudsburg Times in 1902. Quote, 45 rooms, a ladies' parlor, a tiled hall and office, 2 dining rooms, and an elevator. Continuing, the grounds contain a circular gateway 100 feet wide, 60-foot wide roadway, and octagonal summer house. On a plateau sat a gardener's cottage, 2 barns, a carriage house, and the Moorish well house containing a 4-horse engine. There was an artesian well bored 189 feet in solid rock. The water is of the purest, an apple orchard and garden, a lake of 12 acres abundantly stocked. One passes the ice house, then the gas house, and then gradually ascending 125 feet to the hotel and ornamental grounds. There are also hothouses, 2 fountains, and a stable. Sadly, none of these buildings have survived. The Shirley Inn Annex suffered a fire in 1931. A Pocono Record article indicated that the Shirley Inn then became the Mountain Crest Lodge in 1936, owned by the Howitt family. The obituary for Benjamin Howitt mentioned he ran the business for 32 years, retiring in the late 1960s. Jack Howitt, Benjamin's son, had many memories of the Shirley property from childhood. He remembered very ornate fireplace mantels in the old section of the modernized building. He recalled the decorative gardens and grounds, as well as the old fountain and the marble stairs. The grounds were kept cleared on top of the ridge up until the 1960s, providing an amazing panoramic view north to Stroudsburg. As a child, Jack witnessed the paint shed dramatically catch fire. He also shared how the Shirley Inn building met its final fate. In the late 1960s, it was bought by developers who didn't want to maintain it, and so it was destroyed in a controlled burn by the fire department. In recent years, development has been an ongoing concern for the property. Since 1969, the roughly 182-acre Shirley Inn Mountain Crest Lodge site has seen developers design housing communities of between 60 and 115 homes, with the most recent effort thwarted by the bankruptcy of the developer. In 2015, the property was purchased by the Pocono Heritage Land Trust, renamed the Glen Run Nature Preserve, and added to the 4,300 acres of sensitive, important lands already owned by the trust in Monroe County. Many in the community are encouraged that local organizations in partnership with the Pocono Heritage Land Trust will transform the site into a public park with trails, some historic context, and perhaps even restore some of the view it was famous for. We believe a simple overlook point would give local residents, as well as visitors, more pride in the beauty of the surrounding landscape. Many people hike in the Stroudsburg and Water Gap Mountain areas simply for the stunning views of the summits. We visited the Shirley Inn property recently to see what remains. Large stone stairs are impressively still in place, mossy and almost untouched by time. A rectangular stone foundation is all that's left of the Shirley. More modern concrete sheds are slowly crumbling. A swimming pool, constructed sometime during its history, lies filled with vegetation and water off to the side of where the main building once stood. The remains of a stairway and access to the dock on the lake still stands ready to guide visitors to the lake for boating. The once panoramic Poconos view, however, is now obscured by decades of relentless growth. Even after discovering so much information, the incredible Collins family story raises so many more questions. What drove Lillian to suicide? Where's the family buried? Was Clara originally the wealthier of the two and the primary source of funds? Were both Clara and Sam what today would be considered fast operators or con artists, or did they simply financially overextend themselves? Where and when did Clara Collins die? These questions will require a lot of digging, and for those curious, perhaps we can construct a more complete picture of the Collins story. For now, it serves as a reminder that Stroudsburg history contains a multitude of fascinating tales attached to people and places, both still and around and long gone. We should ensure that this rich heritage is preserved for future generations. And thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for Bill?
No questions?
You did such a good job. Now, is the lake up there, is that a natural lake, or did he build that?
There's some thought that it's an artificial lake.
Yeah.
It looks like a dam was constructed at the end of it.
Okay, okay. Now, what, in the years that he lived here in the area, and obviously he did have money, did he participate in community affairs? Was he a benefactor to Stroudsburg at all?
He was a benefactor, but I didn't really delve into that part of the history.
Okay.
But going back to my point here, was Clara the main financier of the couple? I didn't mention in this story, but she was a relative of Jacob Singmaster. And Singmaster was the original owner of Harriet Hall. Singmaster had a tannery located right down here behind the YMCA. That whole area was a tannery. And I was looking up the Singmaster family. I mean, it wasn't germane to this discussion, but when Singmaster died in 1876, his estate was valued at $1.3 million. And in 1876, that was like real money. Clara was a relative of his, and how much of that estate went to Clara was never really clearly identified. Yes?
That Mrs. Lambert, you said she was a widow?
Yes.
Do you know to whom she was married?
I do not. I didn't research her either.
Okay. Because that's my grandmother's maiden name.
Really?
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious.
Well, that would be an avenue for research. Yeah.
Why did she go to jail? What was the reason?
Because Clara was convinced that Fanny Lambert was trying to get her daughter to run away. And at the time, the Collins had some weight in this community. And so it wouldn't surprise me if a bug in the district attorney's ear made that happen. I have no evidence for that. Yes?
This Mrs. Lambert, could she possibly have been the birth mother of Lillian, since they adopted her?
That's never been really addressed. Any additional? Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We want to invite everybody for some refreshments and cookies, etc., in the other room. And what else was I going to say? Next month, you have to come to third Thursday next month. We have Kim Williams, a railroad enthusiast, who will talk about this little railroad called the Dinky. The Dinky is pretty neat. So if you're in the area, stop by on the third Thursday. and it was very good to see everyone. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John.